I see a little,
You got an ovation?
oh, whoops. Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, February 18th, 2025 here in House Transportation Committee. And we are starting off this afternoon in updates and information on mileage-based user fees. And Commissioner Collier in the back there, and Patrick Murphy is first up in the witness chair. And it's that simple. We're going to hand it over to you and go from there, I believe. And then we'll ask questions as we go. And you'll refresh my memory about some trigger that happens at 15% or something of that nature and all that good stuff. So
Well, thanks very much. For the record, Patrick Murphy, State Policy Director with the Agency of Transportation. I am joined here today with our PPAID Director, Policy Planning Intermodal Development Director, Michelle Boomhauer, as well as our Commissioner of D&D, Andrew Collier. And this has been going on probably the third year of the project that we've had to identify road usage charges appropriate for electric vehicles. And so our division has worked very closely with the Department of Motor Vehicles to advance this work. Start with just sort of setting the stage of where we are right now. You've seen various iterations of this for EV adoption here in the state of Vermont. So we're at about 18,000 vehicles, of which nearly 11,000 are fully electric. And
it's all right.
Sorry, Patrick. And the percentage, do you have that in your?
So the percentage of, it's important to sort of define what we're talking about. Percentage that's been discussed in the Climate Action Plan and elsewhere is reaching a threshold of 15% of new vehicle sales. So it's not of total registrations, but of new vehicle sales. And that's, those are slides that we presented in earlier work on incentives, but essentially for the past year or so, for the full year, we're about 12%. But the third quarter had risen to about 13.6%. And I believe the last quarter was about that amount as well. So we're getting nearer to the 15%, but not quite there.
And is the new a moving target? No. I mean, so I had one 6 years ago and sold it to somebody. Is that that's a new registration? Somebody in Vermont?
No, so that's why, yeah, when we're talking about 15%, that's of new vehicle sales. It's not, the transaction of a used vehicle being sold. It's representing how is the market shifting with the new vehicle purchases or leases.
So the percentage that we're at now, let's say 14 or 15, the percentage of actual vehicles owned by Vermonters driving around is higher than 15% electric.
Could you rephrase that?
So if it's just, so then if we're not capturing them all, because, I said I sold an electric vehicle a couple of years ago.
Sure.
It's bought by another Vermonter, that wouldn't be caught in this percentage.
Right. But just because there are so many, the percentage of used vehicles that are out there that are electric, that percent is going to be actually much smaller.
Okay.
When you're reselling. So that's why we look to the new vehicle sales as an indicator. In terms of total registrations, I think we're sort of near 3%.
Okay.
Between 2 and 3%.
Yeah, that makes sense now.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So this is, you've seen this before as well, is sort of modeling what has been done out of the climate action plan. There's been modeling done to see how many vehicles we need to be able to sell by 2025 and 2030, which are important years for meeting our greenhouse gas emissions reductions. These can vary depending on the battery types, so fully electric versus plug-in hybrids, how the vehicles are being used. So this isn't actually saying we will definitely meet these targets if we have these number of vehicles. I won't go through this. You had plenty of testimony last week about the model year 2026 regulations for advanced clean cars too. But just get into the background of how we began this work. First, what is a road usage charge? Very clearly in its name, it attempts to try and account for a particular vehicle's impact upon our infrastructure network, so roads, bridges, and the like. Over time, the gas tax, which has been used as a proxy for that impact, has become less and less reliable because as more vehicles become more fuel efficient, the disparity between different vehicle types becomes much wider. So the gas tax is a road usage charge. We've also looked at a miles-based user fee. Annual flat fees are attempts to account for road usage, and then a per kilowatt hour fees normally applied to a public charging station. And that's to attempt to account for out-of-state travel. So this was in a prior presentation as well, but just to give you a sense of how fuel sales are declining and what we're expecting in terms of revenue declines because of that. And so in the green, you're seeing the losses due to electrification, and then in the darker blue, you're seeing losses just due to the increasing fuel efficiency of our fleet for gas vehicles. And what this has been showing is sort of the prior losses that we've already seen. So flat fees are fairly common to try and make up for the loss of revenue. Most states, except for the Northeast and a handful in the Southwest, are implementing some kind of flat fee. Beginning January 1st of this year, Vermont also adopted a flat fee, but did so differently in directing the revenue from that towards EV charging infrastructure. We can talk more about that, but that would sense that after a mileage-based user fee was implemented. And that flat fee that we have here in Vermont is, as you can see, far less than the average. For kilowatt hour fees, there are a few states that have enacted legislation and struggled to implement this. In Montana, for example, administrative costs are quite high, over 10% of their program. We looked at this as part of our road usage charge study that began in 2021 and found that it was not a net revenue generator until we have more volume. There are other aspects to it that make it more difficult to see the revenue that we might like from out-of-state travel. People can avoid public fast chargers and focus on level 2 chargers that might be private. at a hotel or somewhere else. And so it's a little easier to avoid than the typical gas tax. And it also suffers from some of the same drawbacks of the gas tax, that it is a poor proxy for the amount of usage of the roads. It can change from winter to summer. It can change even within a charging session. So there are some difficulties that we've seen with it. And then lastly, the challenge for us is folks that don't have access to home charging could rightly sort of claim a taxation that people are using fast chargers in some cases in lieu of access to home charging and depend on that. And those tend to be folks that are renting or multi-unit dwellings. And so there would then need to be some sort of mechanism in place to ensure that we're not doubly charged for that usage.
So the other states in gray have no legislation, the previous slide.
That's right.
So, okay, and then the other ones are proposed legislation. And the darker, the tan is, they have a tax on it for us.
So that it's something that's been enacted.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily something that's been implemented yet. Some states are struggling to implement.
Oh, so the
it.
kilowatt tax enacted may not be in use right now.
That's right. In some cases, the trigger is a threshold in the future, a
Okay,
date in the future, I should say.
okay,
Yeah,
and the other ones are just introducing legislation.
that's right.
Oh, okay,
So it's definitely a less
Yeah.
tested trying to collect revenue.
thank you.
And then lastly, we have sort of where mileage-based user fees have been considered or either as part of studies, research, or pilot programs. There's a few enacted programs, but the only one that is actually going to become mandatory thus far is the state of Hawaii, where they are proposing something similar to what we have proposed. They have the benefit of being an island and not dealing with all the considerations that we have with our borders on Quebec, New York, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. But they have the only program that is actually working towards a mandatory solution. Oregon, Utah, they have voluntary programs, so people can participate in lieu of paying a flat fee. So as I referenced earlier, we went through a road usage charge study that included the former commissioner from Department of Motor Vehicles and a number of other folks from across state government and relevant stakeholders, and developed some principles about how we would consider the various revenue options. And so clearly the need to sustain our infrastructure for the long term, making sure that there's greater fairness among all drivers so that vehicles are contributing to the network that they're using, and then making sure that the funding policy is aligned with our climate action plan and Vermont Comprehensive Energy Plan. The recommendations out of that were really to focus on what we can do now and do simply. So the Department of Motor Vehicles has invested quite a bit of money in really updating their core IT systems, and that has provided an important platform for us to be able to work off of. We also have a vehicle safety inspection process each year, which was a key part where the odometer readings are already collected. So that's a key part of the solution that we came up with, which is not as technology heavy as some of the other programs that were referenced earlier that tend to be voluntary. So the thought was to look at what is most cost effective in being able to implement something when you're working with plug-in devices for vehicles or trying to work with automakers on accessing telematics. That becomes a more challenging and costly endeavor. And so the focus was really on taking the data that we're already collecting and being able to use it, apply a factor to it, and then let that evolve over time to understanding that there are issues with folks that live on the border, that travel out of state, that there are issues that would need to be worked out if this were to become a broader system. But right now, that electric vehicles hadn't been at that time paying anything into the transportation fund to support charging infrastructure. So it's about evolving a fairer system and then building on that so that we're even fairer still in the future. Avoiding privacy concerns was another. The odometer reading based system was supported by folks within this advisory committee. And then we had the opportunity to apply for some federal money that would help us implement the program. So we looked at applying for that. We did in the spring of this past year, and as we talked about in a couple of earlier sessions, that money is frozen at the moment. And we're hopeful that the new administration, which has voiced some alignment with being able to account for electric vehicle road usage, that there might be some avenue there, but the reality is that we have to look at some other options, Plan B and even C, to figure out how we might implement this program. We looked as part of our work in developing an implementation plan. We looked at research that was done at the University of Vermont at how the impacts might be felt by various households throughout the state. And I think somewhat counterintuitive to some folks, while still regressive, a miles-based user fee is actually more progressive than gas tax. What your folks with lower incomes and those living in more rural areas tend to have vehicles that are less fuel efficient and travel further. And so the amount of tax burden on those folks tends to be higher. When you're switching to a miles-based user fee, and then particularly if you're making the switch because your vehicle has transitioned to electric, you're able to see some savings, both in terms of the mileage that's being charged, but then also from the fuel and maintenance cost over the course of a year. This is demonstrating those particular savings so that folks can see this this charge in relationship to the other costs of owning a vehicle. So they're estimated to be nearly $1,000 here in the state of Vermont, depending on where your utility is and how you charge in fuel and maintenance costs. Whereas the average miles-based user fee is probably somewhere around $200, $214. What's avoided in federal taxes is about half that, because we pay 18.4 cents per gallon for the federal gas tax, and roughly 32 cents or so for state. So people are still not necessarily paying that federal gas tax under a mileage-based user fee, although I know there's some discussion about revisiting that. This is to try and sketch out what a system would look like. So as I said before, the DMV has invested quite a bit in upgrading its systems. And because of that, we have this opportunity to build off of it. If we were still working with the, 50, 60-year-old mainframe system, whatever it was, a collection of dozens of databases, we would not be able to do something as cost effectively through the systems that we have. So that has been a really important foundation to the work here for implementing a mileage-based user fee. And what we are envisioning is that folks would be able to deal with this sort of through their MyDMV system if they chose to. There would still be the traditional options to pay at the counter and in person. But the other piece of it is to be able to more closely align with what people experience now with the gas tax. So to be able to pay on a frequency that mirrors that and ensure that people aren't impacted with one big payment right away at the registration or registration renewal process.
Representative Paul?
So I go on vacation and I leave Vermont. So in a gasoline vehicle. So I am paying the federal gas tax as I travel through New Hampshire and wherever else I'm going. And gasoline tax in the state in which I'm actually filling up. So with a mileage-based user fee, how are you going to calculate if I'm in an electric vehicle? Not all my mileage is going to be in the state of Vermont. And when I travel to New York or Ohio or somewhere, that I'm paying their fee along the way.
Right.
So am I going to be am I doubly charged is what, if I say 12,000 miles a year, you're basing my mileage-based user fee on, however, only 8,000 of that was
Sure.
actual Vermont mileage. 4,000 I've already paid in other taxes or fees along the way.
Right.
Scrapping it, so.
So the interesting part about this is that there just hasn't been much implemented elsewhere. So all around us, there's no mileage-based user for any ways to kind of account for the revenue or for the usage within someone else's state.
Okay.
There's not a per kilowatt hour charge
Right.
around us. So there's no concern at the moment of double taxation.
Right.
There is, so there is sort of some element where mileage will be charged for out of state travel. And that's what I was alluding to earlier is that right now they're not paying anything. So the thought is let's do the easiest, most cost effective thing to at least account for that and then try and evolve the system so that over time, there might be other options that are added that can be elected at the point of registration or elsewhere so that people are able to account for their mileage. And that might be opting into something that it touches on privacy issues or that allows somebody to fully account for their vehicles just in the state of Vermont.
Right.
But we're not there yet.
Okay.
And, the gas tax has similar issues in the, people can pay here and travel most of their miles outside the state or vice versa, that they could pay very little here and still be traveling on our roads. So it's a sticky solution, sticky issue we don't have a solution for just yet.
Right now.
Right.
I mean, I own Honda and I get a postcard in the mail that says you're at your 60,000 mile check. I'm like, how do they know I traveled 60,000? How do they?
Right. So that's through the vehicle telematics
Yeah.
where they
Right.
can, yeah.
Yeah.
And so more and more vehicles are, have that sort of technology, and that might be some,
In the future,
future
we'll see
way of
that.
being able to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
And so there are other models as well, that are sort of similar to this in the, medium heavy duty sector for the IFTA IRP. You can see here, there's international, agreements about how to apportion, tax between states and different jurisdictions. And so that is kind of part of the thinking, that once you have a mileage-based user fee in place, and maybe that becomes a model for others, within New England that also have annual state, vehicle safety inspections, that might be a way to begin to work towards that regional solution.
Representative Patton?
Yeah, and pardon me if you're gonna get to this at some point, but you probably, I don't know if you were here, or you heard, Representative Keithley brought up the fact that we're, not collecting for the federal folks, are not collecting anything on electric vehicles. And, hey, if Vermont puts in for a mileage-based user fee, it would account for state gas tax in a way. Why wouldn't we just add the federal in there too, that amount, which would make EV pay an equivalent to a gas vehicle, provide more funds, which I think is a brilliant idea or to consider. Where's the federal government as far as, is there anything going on about, there's a lot going on. Is there anything going on about this that's going to get anywhere in the next 4 years? So that they're.
I can't tell you what is going to happen in the next 4 weeks, but I would, the prior administration had, with the support, bipartisan support, 69 votes to pass the infrastructure law. And in it, there's a section that speaks to these mileage-based user fee issues, and to use some of the pilot program work as potential models for a national solution. And so that was the idea behind the grant that we were awarded.
They
that we could,
would get something out of it because,
That's right.
Yeah.
so the states could kind of test different methods out and hopefully kind of help the federal government come up with a solution themselves. I'm not sure where that will go from here. To Representative Keyser's point, so it goes back to the question around, the system being imperfect and folks living on the border and potentially paying for miles that are outside the state of Vermont. And that's, a legislative question, whether, you seek to go right up to the full amount that gas vehicles are paying for both state and federal gas tax, or whether you leave some room in there because it is an imperfect system, and because some folks will be paying somewhat differently because of their travel patterns and where they are.
Thank you.
Sure. So this is, I know it's a lot, but we're basically, we have vehicle safety inspection stations that are managed by one of our vendors. They're collecting odometer readings with each annual inspection. They're now validating that reading with a photo capture. And so the data already exists. It's really a question of how does that data migrate into our other system, which manages the vehicles and the registration process, the licensing, all of it. And how does that come together so that a fee can be appropriately applied to vehicles once they are appropriately identified in the system as being subject to this. And then that gets reconciled in some way. But we have talked about in last year's legislative report is to do that at the registration process. That it makes more sense instead of sort of focusing on the person, multiple vehicles, to focus on the vehicle, because that's where the impacts are being made, and to make the registration contingent upon having a vehicle safety inspection with an odometer reading and having that fee having been paid. This is speaking to the rate setting considerations that were in that report. And it's looking at how do we make sure that the mileage-based user fee doesn't just become, sort of the same dynamics at play as the gas tax and decline over time. So we've talked about including administrative costs, which are somewhat higher for this kind of a program because it's just the infrastructure isn't quite there in the same way the gas tax is and has been. Going back in time to figure out sort of the last time adjustments were made were in 2013, 2014, to make sure that we're fully accounting for all that has been lost in the last 10 years. So starting from a good point that reflects what we need for the transportation system, and then making sure that over time that is pegged to some sort of inflation escalator, so that we have a sustained revenue source for electric vehicles. This table gives you a sense of how much people are paying right now and how that would potentially change under what we've included as possible rate. So 1.78 cents per mile is taking those different factors into account. Where were we in 2013 timeframe in terms of fuel efficiency, taking into account the administrative costs that might be between 3.6 and 5% to implement a mileage-based user fee, declining over time, and then again over time, the idea would be to peg this to some sort of consumer price index. Compliance, as I began to talk about, it's also through the registration process, putting a hold. So when people go to renew, someone at the desk would be able to see whether or not, or if they're online, it would just be automated to see whether or not they are current. If they're not current, then they wouldn't be able to proceed with the registration process. There could be an option if people didn't go to actually get their vehicle inspected. And so there's no odometer reading to even be had. An option where it would default to just a higher percentile flat fee. So if you go back to where we're looking at the average vehicle being $326 at 20,000 miles, that default fee be somewhere approaching that number rather than the average.
Thank you.
And the hope is that over time that encourages people to actually get their safety inspections and kind of dial down onto what their actual mileage is. So we talked about the grant that we applied for, and there may be other options to sign on to a different grant to be able to implement something. But this is likely going to be on a different time horizon than what we initially expected, July 2026. That would be the sort of soonest that we'd be able to do something. And more likely, given that we're not coming forward with language and we're uncertain about what the funding picture is, we would be probably looking more at something like January 2027. I will update the slide deck here. I added this in just for context for you all, where the legislative direction is coming from. So in 2023, the Transportation Bill, Act 62, directed the agency to begin working towards this. There was also money that was carved out as a state match in fiscal year 24 and 25, splitting the $700,000 match between those 2 years, $350,000 the first year, and then again another $350,000. And then it has language talking about a flat fee for a plug-in hybrid, because we don't have the ability to say whether or not somebody's traveled on a mile, their miles on electricity or not. And then working towards a per kilowatt hour charge on public charging stations, if that became feasible, if we found some way to be able to do it. And then the last is just that the agency would not implement anything, of course, until there would be language and statute to do so. So that is the gist of where we are right now. I'm happy to field questions.
Representative Friesen?
Yeah, good. So I'm on the your chart that shows the gas tax paid and the various vehicles and how we go out. And I see that the mileage-based user fee applies only to EVs. Was there any discussion about including plug-ins and hybrids in that calculation?
Yeah, we did discuss that as part of the road usage charge study. And what we just came to was it's really hard to figure out. It would be as arbitrary a number as a flat fee, but potentially more costly to implement. So instead, what we talked about is a flat fee for plug-in hybrids that attempted to account for the usage that isn't being collected. And in our initial report here to the legislature last year, I think we had talked about using some existing statutory language that is for other specialized fuels and would sort of have a registration fee that was maybe 3/4 times what the normal registration fee is. Instead, as it developed over the past year, there was an infrastructure fee put in place. And so now there is a flat fee, $44.50. And upon implementing the mileage-based user fee, the statute says that we would then continue that flat fee for plug-in hybrids, and that money would be directed towards the transportation fund.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then that would be a sort of decision for the legislature when implementing the miles-based user fee. Did you want to update that flat fee as well, and put any kind of escalator in at that time, or put whatever the wish or the body was.
Thank you.
Representative
Thank you for that, Patrick. What was the act? I just lost the slide.
62.
Act 62.
Yeah,
Okay.
I added this in just
Okay.
over lunch, so
Okay.
I'm recognizing that maybe more context would be needed. But I'm going to share the slides with.
Thank you. And one other thing I missed was right at the beginning, the conversation about the 15,000 EVs. Like, was the initial idea that when registrations in Vermont hit 15,000 EVs and plug-in hybrids, that we would then move to the mileage-based user fee?
It was 15%. of,
2%.
of new vehicle sales.
Okay,
And the thought was that that's sort of a threshold. There's a theory around the adoption of innovations, that, once you've reached, 15%, that it becomes more mainstream and sort of takes off under its own sort of power. We're closely approaching that number, and I think the legislature last year felt that even though we were close, where the funding from that EV infrastructure fee was being directed into charging infrastructure that also supported goals that aligned with the climate action plan, that that was the best way to kind of move forward. But in the climate action plan, there is sort of reference to not enacting a mileage-based user fee until there was 15%. It's not a magic number, as I've explained in the past. And in fact, when you look at that, the massive states that have already adopted flat fees for EVs, about 30 plus, it hasn't changed EV adoption scenarios. They have had flat fees in place for several years now, where we've just begun, but there's not really, I think, a proven correlation between a small fee like what we've adopted here in Vermont and that discouraging adoption in any sort of way.
and that 15% of new vehicle sales includes plugins as well?
Yes, it includes plugins, yeah.
And one more question.
Sure.
So in the MBUF that we have planned is not ready to be rolled out. We talked about this a little bit last week because of a glitch with the DMV or something.
So you're referring to the infrastructure fee?
I thought it was the mileage.
So the mileage-based user fee, we don't have statutory language for. We don't have the access to federal grant funds to begin real work on that.
Okay.
So we have to come up with an alternative plan.
Okay.
Representative Powell?
Yes, so during your discussion, you talked about, everything that goes into looking at the options and all the considerations, which are quite a bit. But a few times you brought up, you brought up the option that's always there to adjust the fees over time, so we don't end up like we are with the gasoline tax, with, diminishing returns, but more costs. And my question is really about now on gasoline vehicles. Was there ever any discussion of including a mileage-based user fee, maybe at a different rate, to sort of now begin to capture, their, I'll say, dwindling contribution over time, assuming we go forward with this, now they're contributing everything.
Sure.
Basically, but that, to sort of capture that, because, it would be a bifurcated system, mileage-based user fee for EVs, the gas tax. And the discussion of, hey, whatever we come up with fees for mileage-based user fees, we probably should strongly consider having an automatic adjustment or some adjustment over time. Is there any ever discussion of how you would do the same for gasoline vehicles?
We haven't discussed that as part of this work. The focus of this work has always been how do we account for the growing number of electric vehicles? And so that was to the problem that we saw developing and needed to address. I think what we came up with was what is the simplest solution to be able to do that and to get good at it. I mean, to be able to refine the system so that it is able to become fairer over time. We think it's fairer to move in this direction to make sure that all vehicles are sort of paying their a fair share and being able to contribute not just to roads and bridges, but everything that you all have seen over the past several weeks, the whole transportation system. But really, we need to get good first at implementing this mileage-based user fee for electric vehicles. This is really a way to implement something and at the same time pilot it, because we're not capturing anything right now from electric vehicles. We're already capturing some sort of revenue from all the rest of the vehicles. So better to start with the imperfect system with the vehicles where we're not capturing anything than to move too quickly towards the rest of the vehicles until it's been more refined. So I think that's the way we've thought about it. It's like as more of a pilot, knowing that these numbers will grow and we want to be able to capture that revenue.
We're focused on this, not on the.
That's right. Yeah.
Picture. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Representative.
Yeah, did we get that $3 million from the SIRC grant?
Yeah, so we were awarded the $3 million in November, but we have not,
Number 24.
yes.
Yeah.
But we have not received it. And all discretionary grants are paused at the moment.
Yeah, I didn't know where that was in the queue.
Yeah, so there was a lot that the prior administration had been trying to work with different entities to get grant agreements in place, but all of that's paused.
Representative Tomlin.
Thank you. And so just to make sure I understand correctly, until the MBUF is implemented, there is still that additional registration fee for EVs, right? And will that continue to go towards charging infrastructure, or will that change what direction that revenue is going in?
So right now, as the statute is written, the EV infrastructure fee collected from battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid vehicles is going towards charging infrastructure programs that are managed by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development until such time as a mileage-based user fee is implemented. So that's when you read Act 148, last year's transportation bill, there's all the language in the different sections that establish the fee, but then right at the end is sort of when the effective dates, and it's in that last section where it basically says that once a mileage-based user fee is implemented, then that changes. So then it both repeals the EV infrastructure fee for battery electric vehicles, and then it keeps in place the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle fee, but it redirects it back to the transportation fund.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Patrick, if I understand it, as we kind of talked to our committee a long time about, we have to move the T-bill through. And one of the big issues that was sort of on top of that timeline is revenue towards transportation. We've received plenty of testimony that you've also been part of, that our revenues are at a flat somewhere, most of 1-2% max in the transportation piece. We have 15% of the vehicles out there on the road not contributing at all to the repair of the roads or the upkeep of bridges, et cetera. We heard testimony about gasoline tax and what that would or wouldn't do. And we heard testimony about retail delivery fees. We heard some mileage-based user fee last week, and a big follow-up from you this week. May or may not any of them be actionable or not, but this one was one that we thought we would start be doing in July of 2025, which I just heard you, I think, say you're talking about 18 months, potentially, when you said January 1st of 2027. So
yeah,
solutions wise to our committee's huge issue of a lack of growing transportation revenues, this is one of the areas that we had thought we were headed in a direction that we would see some revenue, and we're not going to see it for at least 18 more months, both because because we're not putting in new language in this bill, or not proposed at this point, and because the federal grant to help you implement such a thing is on hold with no clear spot, and that's gonna cost us 18 months at least before we're gonna get new revenue to help repair keep our infrastructure where we're at. Is that, so we were looking at a whole number of revenue issues, one of which we thought we were putting in place is not gonna happen for at least 18 months, and we haven't, of course, taken any action on any of those other areas, but that's sort of my understanding for the committee. I could be, make sure I could be off on that, but the biggest takeaway I have right now is we were intending to hope to charge in July of 2025. The money we are charging today is going to chargers through ACCD and not to the roads. We'd hoped there was new money coming. There's not new revenue coming. And that, in effect, our big picture for us as a committee is where are we going to get sustainable transportation revenue from? This isn't part of the answer right now. Still, potentially the agency is saying it's part of the answer in the long term, but it's not now and for the next 18 months.
So,
I missed some pieces on all that.
just, there's one clarification, and that is that, the prior administration took its time in issuing the funding opportunity in the first place. So that's where the first date of July 1, 2025 came from. The law was passed in November of 2021. And the funding opportunity wasn't announced until this spring. So that was the first opportunity that we had to actually apply for the federal funding. So our revised estimate was July 1, 2026. If we were to continue on that time frame. Now we're faced with uncertainty around actually receiving that funding award. That doesn't necessarily mean that we can't meet that July 2026 date. It will be difficult though. And in reality, we'll need statutory language next year and enough lead time to be able to then implement it. So we've got to identify a secondary funding source and then be able to have the time to implement on our systems. So that's where we get sort of a more realistic date is probably January 2027. So albeit from our, revised date, we're maybe 6 months difference that we're looking at, but we're still working towards implementing a mileage-based user fee.
Representative Pouch, remember?
On the same topic, so, it makes me wonder if waiting for the federal grant was, at this point, maybe not a good approach. So that was 3 million plus a little bit, I think, say 3 million. Is that what the cost is going to be to manage programming and some testing and some training of inspectors and some outreach, a lot of education, outreach to let people know and then legislate you need some laws around it. Is the cost of that about $3 million? So if we said, forget the grant, we're not getting the grant, let's just go forward and do it. Do we know about how much it would cost the state?
Our grant proposal was for, it was $3.75 million. So match that was approved by the legislature was $700,000, and then you're allowed to use some in-kind match as well. The precise number of what it would cost to implement isn't available until we go through a process with our Agency of Digital Services, which works with a third party to kind of verify and make sure that the state is cost effectively using its funds for a solution with what would probably be both our existing vendors. So, we don't want to sort of get out in front and say what it would cost without having gone through that process. But that number also included, you know, a significant amount of outreach communications, to make sure that we were, you know, doing all that we needed to do on that front, and also being able to get a lot of good data out of that so that we could, you know, make sure that each new iteration is building on, what we're learning in the prior.
So, is it fair to say that number, the grant number, is about what it might cost? I mean, we must have.
I mean, the number didn't just come out of nowhere.
Right.
You know, our consultants that worked with us, CDM Smith, have worked with Hawaii and other states with their programs, both voluntary and in Hawaii's case, a mandatory or working towards a mandatory program. So we have some sense, but it's not necessarily apples to apples. Hawaii, for example, has a number of different regional DMVs for each of the islands and different complexities there that we don't have here. So yeah, we're basing it roughly on sort of what has been done there because it is a very similar system and they actually share some of our vendors as well. But there are enough differences that I don't think we can say for certain what the number would be.
Representative Burke?
Yeah, so what's happened to the money from the purchase and use tax and registration fees and energy efficiency charges that EVs are paying?
Well, the purchase and use.
Does that just go into the transportation fund?
For purchase and use, it goes partly into transportation, partly into education and registration fees, all, you know, they're all a part of the same funding, the revenue source. So they're going to the same purposes. Going to, you know, registration fees are going to transportation fund. Yeah,
It's good to acknowledge that EV owners are paying the infrastructure fee in there also. And I think there's always this
yeah, I think in the
understanding that, you know, until we did the infrastructure fund, that EV owners are paying.
yeah, I think in the past, the argument has been made that person use tax has been more for some EVs because they cost more, and what we're starting to see now is a sort of reaching a price parity among the vehicles that you know, are bought by the majority of Vermonters. So that's becoming less of an argument to make as we get more and more vehicles that get closer to their gas counterparts. They're not necessarily paying more into the transportation fund than their gas counterparts.
Patrick, how would you work? Would you, you know, I'm assuming it's more than the inspector just writing down the number when you go in with your car and then get inspected to get two numbers. I'm assuming there would be a third party that had software that would keep track of this and we would bid that out or no? Or would it be just simply writing down a number in the beginning? And
Well, so this, we have existing vendors, one's doing the vehicle inspection.
the
The system.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that data is being entered into the AVIP system, and a new development, relatively recent, I think in the last year or so, has been the photo capture. So that there is an ability, or there will be at least, to tie, you know, the entry of that odometer reading with a photo of the actual.
So the current system that we have in place, it can be, what do you want to call it, upgraded. to take this information or no, or would it be a new device or? I was just trying to think of the impact, you know, just.
Yeah, I believe our vehicle and safety inspectors are already capturing that. The commissioners here
Okay,
would speak to that, but they're already capturing it with the tablets. So there's a record that can then, you know, if there's a challenge to, well, you know, you're saying that I've got 5,000 miles, but I only
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah.
3,000.
Yeah.
There could be the way to sort of verify that data.
okay, yeah, I was just curious how that's out.
So then that system would have to be tied in with the vehicle registration system with, you know, so that you're able to bring that together in my DMV and somebody be able to go in and just log on and see, okay, I've got so many miles in there. And I'd be able to pay on a frequency that I chose.
Alright. Thanks.
Sure.
So we're at our time frame for this piece and we're going to head into a break. I do want to mention that we're going to move into some sections on T-bill language. Remember, as a committee, we're going through that kind of timeline to get to the T-bill to the finish line. And then, of course, there's the issue of the revenue, which is where these ties into both. And there's not going to be new T-bill language on this, but there's the bigger picture of where is our transportation revenue going to come from moving in the future. And then the rest of this week, so there'll be T-bill language and there'll be continued discussions on the revenue. If you can increase revenue, the other option is how do we hold T-fund money into our and not leave our portion. So that's part of what we're also going to hear more about through the next week and 2 weeks. A big issue that the speaker has asked to really push for all communities is the issue of accountability. And one of the things that our Ledge Council has done in working with the agency is everything that we required in the T-bill of the last year and the year before, and all of the requirements we put on the agency reports, programs, et cetera. That's what you see filling up the rest of the schedule for this week. So we're either working in T-bill language where we're going next, or you're getting accountability of things that we as a legislature demanded the administration do. And now they're back to report on all of those pieces that Ledge Council helped put together with the agency over the last multiple T-bills. So that's where we're headed next. You're on a break.